Good evening. This is part of the Isaiah Project, and this is a new series that I'm beginning. It's called The Event and Text of the Early First Isaiah. And in it, we'll be looking at the way chapter 3 through 12 forms a literary unit and actually becomes a kind of the initial beginning of the Isaiah scroll. This section today is titled Setting the Stage, Chapter 3 and 4. What makes a close reading of the Isaiah scroll so fascinating is that through it, one is able to experience the spiritual effort of a biblical community responding to their history as it is unfolding. This is a contrast to other readings of the biblical text, say of Exodus, in which the spiritual effort is responding to a remote history that is finished and is being used as a surrogate for their own historical moment. In this case, the memory of the historical moment is haunted by vagueness about facts, and the present seeking answers is difficult to identify. The events of the 12th century BCE migration out of Egypt, for example, are obscure. Facts are lacking, historical verification is lacking. And the persons doing the remembering in the 8th century, or is it in the 7th century, or even later in the 4th century, are obscure and remote to us. But in the Isaiah scroll, we're dealing with a clear, verifiable historical event, and with individuals whose presence can be clearly felt by us as they struggle to make theological sense of what is happening to them. This is both exciting and useful for us who are engaged in our own attempt to come to a theological understanding of what we're going through, and with our own need for a theological vision of the future. In this second talk, we will begin by taking on the early part of the Isaiah scroll, which begins with chapter 3 and ends with chapter 12. In our last talk, we looked at the splendid Hebrew poem, which constitutes chapter 12, a poem likely familiar to us because we sing it as a hymn or as a canticle. Surely it is God who saves us. Well, one might ask, what sort of writer makes use of a poem for closure? This writer did, and as I will attempt to demonstrate, he also opens his text with a poem, namely verse 1 through 7 of chapter 3, whose purpose it is to set the stage for the coming event, namely the encounter of prophet and king in 736. We also noted in our past talk that this section of the text referenced particular dates. We've already mentioned 741 BCE, the year that King Uzziah died. Another is the year in which Isaiah confronted King Ahaz on the road that passes by the Gihon Spring on the east side of the city of David, shortly after his ascension to the throne, 736. And we can date when this section of Isaiah text was finalized, which is certainly sometime before the death of Ahaz, 715, and probably before the capture of the capital of the northern kingdom, which fell to the Assyrians in 722. In other words, the competition of the text happened a few years following the event of the Gihon Spring. The core of 3:12, which one might consider this first installment of the Isaiah scroll, is a narrative of that encounter between king and prophet. It's narrated in chapter 7, and when you look at the place of 3 and 4, 3 and 4 is setting the stage for that which will be narrated in 7. Uriah had been king for 50 years. The last years of his kingship was spent as a co-regent with his son Jotham, but his advisors no doubt continued not only through the co-regency, but also probably to the end of Jotham's reign himself. One can imagine the impatience of a new generation to assume power with the new young king. Just as one can imagine the anxiety of the prophetic school of Jerusalem, to which this equally young Isaiah had been called, had about the capacity of the new leadership to deal with the impending crisis of the kingdom. With this in mind, let us look at the opening unit of chapter 3, which is a poem or at least a poetic prose, and it goes something like this in the Hebrew. Ki hana ha Adanon Yahweh Sabaoth ma Seir ma Jerusalem Bama Yehuda ma Sha'ana Kal Mashanan Kal Lechem Kal Mayim. Translated, isn't it a fact that the Lord, Yahweh of hosts, is removing from Jerusalem and from Judah the essential supply, all the supply of bread, all of the supply of water? Note first that Adonai is not in its common form, but is modified by the definite article, aha, and ends with an own sound, a suffix which intensifies the meaning of the noun, and which is a common occurrence in Hebrew poetry. In this case, this special treatment seems to be dictated by a desire for a kind of a cadence, 6 beats, and then 6 beats more, and then a final line with 8 beats. There's also a consonance, which is made possible by using the Hebrew participles, which are made with the performative mem, m, along with the m endings on the words of Jerusalem, bread, water, Jerusalem, lechem, mayim. This brief text rings with the M sound. The text begins in an unusual manner, not in the way that one would expect a prophetic statement, but in the manner of a declaration of present fact. There are a number of ways to indicate prophetic oracles. One common in Isaiah is the term masha'ah, harsh prophecy, heavy burden, as the beginnings of chapter 13 and those that follow. Another form makes use of the verb naas, Yahweh, naam, Yahweh, says the Lord. Here, however, we read ki hanam, which has been a puzzle for translators. The first word is the very common word for because, or for the demonstrative pronoun that. The second word is equally common, the command behold. I would suggest that the conjunction, the unusual conjunction in this case, should be read as a declarative. Isn't it a fact? Isn't it a fact that God has taken away the sufficient support of bread and water? More important, this material failure is the failure of governments. Key individuals are missing from the government. The hero, the warrior, the judge, the prophet, the soothsayer, the elder, the captains of 50, the men of esteem, the counselors, skilled craftsmen, and those who discern secrets, that is, literally pick up on what's being whispered around. The new people, on the other hand, disrespect their elders. They behave haughtily, the youth against the elder, the base against the honorable. In summation, verse 8 begins with the same kaf yod, ki. In fact, Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen. The attempt to understand these alleged circumstances is colored by later sieges of Jerusalem's history, 701 by Sennacherib and the siege in 587 by Nebuchadnezzar. That causes this text to be read as a judgment oracle, forecasting later traumatic events. An example of this can be seen in the translations of Rabbi Rosenberg, among others who translate the verb forms that are clearly past or presently ongoing activities as futures. The plain reading, for example, of verse 4, when Ahaz die, Na'arim Sharim. Remember, it is God who is speaking. I am setting youth as princes. And verse 5, Wanagash Hayam, the people are being oppressed. In the end, it is not what someone will do in the future to Jerusalem and Judah, but what they have already done to themselves. Their timing couldn't have been worse, for the prophetic school is acutely aware of the rising Assyrian Empire. Already they see the way it's going to transform the Levant. Already they see that Damascus, the longtime enemy, would be defeated by them, and not long afterwards the northern kingdom would follow, which would bring the Assyrians to the very border of Judah, to the doorstep of Jerusalem. Having identified this opening chapter 3 as a poem, the question becomes, how did the prophetic school employ such a poetic unit, and why did they choose to begin what was in effect the first installment of the Isaiah scroll with it? I would suggest that such poetic units are seen by them as the basis for theological reflection. The reflective process would take place in a gathering of elders and disciples of the prophetic community. It would unfold in a series of steps, first that of judgment, then of the discernment of consequences of judgments, the loss that would result, and thirdly, the element of hope for the future that would be found in the context of that loss. The process is substantially theologizing. And this is the first instance of this pattern in the Isaiah scroll. And in time, as we move more deeply into the scroll, you'll find that it is a characteristic feature of the Isaiah scroll. And you will not wait long, because it'll occur in the very next unit, chapter 5, the Song of the Beloved Vineyard. In this opening unit, under the consideration, judgment occurs with verse 24 of chapter 4. Your men shall fall by the sword, and your warriors in war. The city's gates shall lament and mourn, and she shall be emptied out, and she will sit on the ground. As a result, there will be 7 women for every man. Each woman will plead to be called by that man's name in order that they might have their reproach removed. In the future examples of the process, the result is of a judgment of a similar reduction of population, combined with a land that is emptied, rewilded. For example, in 721, we read, on that day they will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep, and eat curds because of the abundance of the milk. Young cows, heifers are notoriously lacking in the amount of milk they produce. But everyone, nevertheless, will be left, who is left in the land, will eat curds and honey. There appears in such a formula a bad news, good news dynamic. In this case, life will go on, marriage and children will happen, and seconding that is a key hope. On that day, the children, on that day, the sprout of the Lord, the Zabak Yahweh, shall be for beauty, for honor, and for the fruiting of the land, for greatness and for glory, for the survivors of Israel. Early on, commentators identified this text as messianic. Christians, but also rabbinic Jews, and even by the late members of the prophetic school itself, before they finally published their scroll around the middle of the 5th century. Thus, it anticipates the messianic text that will be found later in chapter 7, verse 14, chapter 11, verse 1, and it signifies, and it is significant that while the birth of the child is at stake in all of these examples, the terminology is not the same. I take this as an indication that has not created a kind of a formula of messianic expectation, so much as expressing a profound faith in the capacity of the Davidic dynasty to renew itself. This translates into a faith in the future, which in times becomes the faith of the Messiah. The future orientation of the Isaiah scroll, from the beginning to end, is a theological revolution to which we are heirs. The future in the Isaiah orientation is always accompanied by the concept of forgiveness, and in this case, a washing away of filth and blood. And what is interesting is that these themes, which are found throughout the Isaiah scroll, are already present here in what appears to be the original first section of the scroll. And they survive there in a manner that suggests that they are indeed early, if not the original occurrences of these themes. We began this section with 2 questions. How did the school use such poetic units, and why was it chosen to begin what in effect is the initial installment of the Isaiah scroll? The answer to the first question is the school habitually used poetic units for theological reflection. For them, a poetic text held a truth in a way that needed to be unpacked theologically. In this way, the prophetic school discovered the message that needed to be spoken to power. The original poem came into existence with the ascent of Ahaz to the throne, and it would have immediately been subject in that time following that ascension to theological reflection. And in retrospect, that text and that poem and that reflection was the perfect setting of the stage for sending Isaiah to the message with the king. Chapter 5 and 6, which follow it, lay further the background for the message to be delivered to King Ahaz, which is narrated in chapter 7. Our next talk will take up the focus on this narrative that we find in chapter 7. We will entitle that talk, The Event Narrative. Thank you and have a good evening.